The sun blazed mercilessly over the village square, heating the earth until the dust seemed to rise and hang in the air. The girl stood barefoot on the cracked ground, her toes curling nervously against the soil as though she could dig her way out of the nightmare unfolding. She wore a faded blue dress, patched in too many places to count, and her long black hair was plaited simply, the way her stepmother preferred, neat, controlled, without a trace of rebellion. The villagers had gathered in a loose circle, their faces a mix of curiosity and pity, though none dared to interfere. Whispers floated through the crowd like tiny daggers that pierced her ears. "She's so young," one woman murmured. "Younger than his own daughters." A man's rough voice answered, "But what can she do? A girl has no choice." Her stepmother's hand gripped her wrist with the strength of iron, pulling her forward until she stood just a few paces away from the man she was to marry. Her heart pounded wildly, every beat threatening to crack her chest open, yet her body obeyed the tug of her stepmother without resistance. Fear wrapped around her like a second skin, thick and suffocating. She dared not lift her gaze from the dusty ground, for she knew the moment her eyes met his, the weight of her reality would crush her completely. He was waiting, leaning heavily on a carved cane. His face was lined with years and regrets, his beard white, his hair thinning and gray. He was older even than her father would have been had he lived, and the thought made her stomach twist. His eyes, sharp but tired, studied her as if she were an object he had purchased at a market, a possession to add to his household. He did not smile kindly, but there was a smug curl to his lips, the self-satisfaction of a man who had acquired something that others desired but could not obtain. His wealth had bought him this union, wealth her stepmother had hungrily accepted, speaking of dowries and debts until the girl's fate was sealed. The imam's voice rose above the murmurs, calm and steady, reciting the sacred words that would bind them. The girl barely heard them. Her ears rang with the pounding of her blood, with the muffled sobs she refused to release. She wished to run, to cry out, to beg for mercy, but her throat felt locked, her tongue heavy as stone. Her stepmother's nails dug into her arm as a warning. One wrong move, one refusal, and the consequences would be dire. She had seen what happened to girls who resisted. They were shamed, beaten, cast aside like broken pottery. Children watched from the edges of the square, wide-eyed, not yet understanding the cruelty before them. Old women shook their heads, muttering prayers under their breath. Men folded their arms, silent, their eyes averted, as though by not looking directly, they were freed of guilt. But everyone knew, everyone saw, and still, no one spoke. The imam paused, waiting for her answer. It was the moment she dreaded most. Her lips trembled, her chest rose and fell too quickly, and her knees threatened to buckle. She glanced up briefly, just for a second, and met the old man's gaze. His eyes were not unkind, yet they were heavy with expectation, with ownership. In that instant, she realized she had no escape. The world had already decided for her. Her voice, barely above a whisper, answered the imam's question. It was a word spoken with reluctance, the faintest agreement, but it was enough. Enough to seal her fate. The crowd murmured approval, some even smiling as if a happy occasion had taken place. Her stepmother released her grip at last, satisfied, and the imam raised his hands in blessing. The girl felt her heart sink into the earth beneath her, lost forever. The ceremony ended quickly, without celebration, without laughter. There was no feast, no music, only the quiet dispersal of villagers returning to their homes, leaving her standing in the square with the man who was now her husband. She felt smaller than ever, her hands clasped tightly before her, her body stiff with dread. The old man gestured toward the waiting cart that would take them to his home on the far side of the village. As they walked, the girl felt the last of her freedom crumble away. Every step seemed to echo the finality of her choice, or rather, the lack of choice she had ever been given. She thought of her father, long gone, of the warmth of his voice and the way he had once carried her on his shoulders. If he had been alive, none of this would have happened. The bitterness rose in her throat, mingling with tears she could not allow to fall. She held them back, swallowing hard, her face an empty mask. The cart creaked as they climbed aboard, the old man settling himself heavily beside her. She sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the horizon as the village receded. The fields stretched endlessly, golden with wheat and shadowed by distant trees, but none of it seemed beautiful anymore. She could only feel the weight of what had been taken from her. The childhood she would never reclaim, the dreams she could never pursue. The man said little during the ride, only clearing his throat occasionally, adjusting his cane. At one point, she dared to glance at him, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw sadness in his expression, a shadow of something deeper than pride or ownership. But the thought vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the ache of her fear. By the time the cart reached the gates of his estate, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. The house loomed before her, grander than any she had seen, with tall walls and carved wooden doors. It should have impressed her, but it only felt like a prison. The doors opened, servants bowed, and the girl stepped across the threshold, leaving behind the last trace of her old life. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of incense, and the walls were decorated with rich carpets and tapestries. Yet none of the beauty could soothe her. She felt like a bird placed inside a gilded cage, her wings clipped before she had ever learned to fly. Her husband's footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he led her deeper into the house, his cane striking with each step, a constant reminder of his age and her youth. Her chest tightened, her hands trembled, and she whispered a prayer only she could hear. She prayed for strength, for courage, for a miracle she could not yet imagine. Little did she know, the path she dreaded so deeply was about to twist in ways no one expected. That night the house felt too large, its high ceilings and endless corridors swallowing every sound. The girl sat at the edge of the bed, her body rigid, her fingers gripping the blanket as though it could shield her from what was coming. The room glowed faintly with the light of an oil lamp, shadows dancing along the carved wooden walls. Outside, the night wind rustled the trees, carrying the distant howl of a dog. Her heart beat so violently she thought the old man beside her must hear it, yet he remained silent, his breathing steady but heavy, like a man carrying more than his body could bear. She dared not look directly at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, on the intricate rug that must have cost more than her entire household had ever owned. The patterns blurred as her vision swam with unshed tears. Her hands twisted together nervously, her breath shallow. She had heard stories from other girls, what happened to brides on their first night, the cruelty some endured, the resignation others accepted. She had braced herself for the worst, her stomach knotted with fear. But when the silence stretched unbearably long, she finally risked a glance. He was not watching her hungrily as she had imagined. Instead, he sat in a chair by the table, leaning on his cane, his eyes fixed on something across the room. Following his gaze, she saw it, a framed portrait of a young woman, her face gentle, her smile luminous. The painting was old, its edges faded, yet the care with which it had been placed was unmistakable. The girl in the portrait looked no older than she was now. The old man's lips parted slightly, and in a voice hoarse from years, he murmured, "You remind me of her." The girl froze, startled by the tenderness in his tone. His words were not aimed to frighten or command, but to recall. He leaned forward, his gnarled hand brushing the edge of the portrait's frame. "She was my wife, the only one I ever loved." His shoulders slumped as he spoke, and his voice cracked with age and sorrow. "Death took her too soon, before we had a chance to live the life we dreamed. Since then, this house has been empty." She said nothing, though her chest loosened slightly. Her fear, sharp as a knife, dulled to confusion. She had expected force, demands, the stripping away of what little dignity she still had. Instead, she saw a man haunted by memories, clutching at the ghost of someone who no longer lived. He did not reach for her. He did not order her closer. He simply stared at that portrait as though it was all that tethered him to the present. Finally, he turned his gaze toward her. His eyes were not cruel, but they were piercing, searching. "You don't want to be here, do you?" he asked quietly. Her lips trembled. She could not answer honestly, but she could not lie convincingly either. Her silence was its own confession. He nodded, as though he had expected it. "I know," he whispered. "I saw it in your eyes today. Fear, resentment. I don't blame you." He leaned back against the chair, exhaustion settling over him like a heavy cloak. "You think I wanted this?" "No, I wanted her back, and when I saw you, it felt like the past was reaching for me again. Foolish, isn't it, to believe a face could heal what time has stolen?" The girl's fingers loosened their grip on the blanket. She had no words. She did not understand his sorrow, not fully, but for the first time since the marriage had been forced upon her, she realized he was not a monster lurking in shadows. He was a man broken by loneliness, clutching desperately at anything that reminded him of love. The lamp flickered, the flame bending in the draft that seeped through the window. He sighed, leaning heavily on his cane as he pushed himself to his feet. The effort seemed to pain him, his back hunched, his hands shook faintly. She watched him shuffle toward the bed, her breath caught in her throat. Fear pricked at her again, but when he reached her, he did not sit beside her. He pulled the blanket gently over her lap, his touch surprisingly careful, almost paternal. "Rest," he said softly. "You are safe here. Whatever else people may think, I won't harm you." His words carried weight, as though they were a vow he intended to keep. She lay back slowly, unsure whether to believe him, but too tired to resist. Her eyes followed him as he returned to the chair, lowering himself with a groan. He remained there, watching the portrait, not her, his fingers tracing the cane's handle absent-mindedly. She listened to the rhythm of his breathing, the occasional crack of his joints when he shifted. The silence between them was no longer suffocating but strange, uncertain. As she drifted toward uneasy sleep, her mind circled around his words. He had not chosen her for love, nor for lust, but for memory. She was a replacement, a shadow of someone long gone. The thought should have angered her, but instead, it left her unsettled. What did it mean to live in the shadow of another woman? What did it mean to be wanted, not for who she was, but for who she resembled? Her eyes closed, but even in her dreams, the image of that portrait lingered, the young woman's smile, the old man's trembling hands reaching toward her. The girl woke before dawn to find him still in the chair, head bowed in sleep, his cane resting across his knees. The oil lamp had burned out, leaving the room bathed in the pale gray of early morning. For a moment, she simply stared at him, her fear softened by a flicker of pity she had not expected to feel. He looked smaller when he slept, less imposing, more vulnerable. His chest rose and fell shallowly, his face slackened by dreams. She wondered if he dreamed of the woman in the portrait, if even in his sleep, he clung to her memory. Something inside her shifted. Not acceptance, not forgiveness, but the first stirring of understanding. As she rose from the bed and pulled the blanket around her shoulders, she whispered a prayer, not just for herself, but for him. For the man whose wealth had bought her, whose grief had chained them both. The world outside would think their marriage a transaction completed, a bargain fulfilled. But within the walls of that house, it was something far more complicated, a story neither of them yet knew how to live. And though she feared what the coming days would bring, a strange thought nestled in her chest. Perhaps, in this union born of cruelty and loss, something unexpected might still grow. Days slipped into weeks, and the girl's life inside the grand house unfolded like a strange, endless dream. She woke each morning to the sound of birds calling from the garden, their songs reminding her of freedom she could no longer touch. The servants moved quietly around her, bowing politely, but their eyes carried questions they dared not ask. She ate at long tables meant for many, yet always sat across from one man, her husband, who spoke little and often seemed more absent than present. She had prepared herself for a prison of cruelty, but the prison she found was one of silence. He never raised his voice, never struck her, never forced her into the horror she had dreaded most. Instead, he moved through the house like a ghost of its master, leaning on his cane, pausing often before that portrait in the parlor. The young woman's face, painted with delicate strokes, looked back at him with unending kindness. He could sit for hours, staring at her, whispering words too soft for anyone to hear. At first, the girl avoided that room. She could not bear the weight of the gaze in the portrait, the knowledge that she was only a substitute for someone who had once been loved deeply. But curiosity tugged at her, and one afternoon, when the old man was outside with the steward, she stepped inside quietly. The air was heavy with the scent of sandalwood, and sunlight spilled through the window, bathing the portrait in gold. She studied the woman's features carefully, the roundness of her cheeks, the curve of her lips, the eyes filled with warmth. Yes, she could see the resemblance. It startled her. For the first time, she understood why he had looked at her that way during the ceremony, why his voice had carried such longing when he said she reminded him of someone. It was not her he had wanted. It was the past, Her chest tightened with a strange mix of anger and pity. She felt like a shadow, an echo of someone else's story. Yet at the same time, she sensed the depth of his loneliness, the years he had spent in this echoing house with nothing but memories for company. Later that evening, she saw him sitting once again in the parlor, his cane resting against his knee, his hand reaching out as if to touch the painted face. His eyes glistened with tears. She lingered at the doorway, torn between retreating and stepping closer. Before she could decide, he spoke without turning his head. "She was the only one who ever made this place feel alive," he said quietly. "Every laugh of hers, every word, filled these halls." And then, silence. For decades. The girl swallowed, unsure whether to answer. Her lips moved before her mind caught up. "You loved her very much." He turned then, his gaze falling on her, surprised but not angry. He nodded. "More than I thought a man could love." She shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twisting together. "And me, what am I to you?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. She regretted them instantly, afraid of his reaction, but he only looked at her steadily, his face weary. "You are a reminder," he said at last. "When I look at you, I feel as though I am closer to her again." "It is selfish. I know that." His voice broke slightly, and he shook his head. "I don't expect you to forgive me for it." His honesty unsettled her. She had expected denial, excuses, perhaps even anger. Instead, he admitted his weakness openly, leaving her with nothing to hold onto but a complicated empathy. That night, she lay awake long after he had retreated to his own chamber. She thought of the portrait, of his trembling hands, of the way his eyes had softened when he spoke of the woman he lost. Slowly, her fear was being replaced by something unexpected, not love, not even acceptance, but understanding. He was not her jailer in the way she had feared. He was a man trapped in his own grief, and she had been pulled into the cage with him. The days that followed brought small changes. He began speaking to her more, not about himself, but about the house, the land, the workers in the fields. Sometimes he told her stories of the past, of festivals that had once filled the village with laughter, of journeys he had taken in his youth. His voice, usually low and solemn, would lift with faint sparks of life when he spoke of those memories. She listened quietly, never interrupting, letting him drift where his mind needed to go. One afternoon, while they sat together in the garden, he handed her a book. Its leather cover was cracked with age, its pages filled with poems written in elegant calligraphy. "She loved this," he said softly. "She used to read them aloud in the evenings." Her voice, it made the words sound like music. The girl traced the lines on the page with her fingertip. She had never owned a book. She had barely learned to read, yet he encouraged her gently, correcting her pronunciation, smiling faintly when she managed a stanza without stumbling. For the first time, she saw warmth in his expression, not just sorrow. It was in those moments that her pity deepened. She saw the cracks in him, the frailty of his body, the fragility of his heart. She realized he did not need a wife in the way others expected. He needed a witness to his grief, someone to fill the silence, someone to remind him that he was still alive even as he clung to the memory of the dead. Yet the burden of that realization weighed heavily on her. She was still a girl, robbed of choice, her future stolen. She did not want to be only a replacement, a ghost of someone else's love. Some nights she wept quietly into her blanket, tears soaking the fabric as she whispered prayers for strength. Other nights, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady tick of the clock, wondering what her life would become. Still, each morning she rose, and each day she played her part. She walked through the halls that now seemed less threatening, tended to the garden, read from the book he had given her. And each day, when she saw him pause before the portrait, she felt a pang of something she could not name, a mix of sadness and tenderness, a bond neither of them had chosen yet could not deny. One evening, as the sky turned crimson with the setting sun, she stood by the window watching the fields. The wind carried the scent of earth and grain, and in the distance, workers' voices rose in laughter. Behind her, the old man's footsteps approached, slow and uneven. He stopped beside her, his gaze following hers out to the horizon. "It's beautiful," she murmured, almost forgetting he was there. "Yes," he said softly. "But not as it once was." Still, he paused, leaning heavily on his cane, his eyes distant. With you here, it feels less empty. Her breath caught. She turned to him, searching his face for mockery, but found only sincerity. For the first time, she saw him not as the man forced upon her, nor as the grieving widower lost in memory, but as a soul reaching out, fragile and human. She said nothing, but in that silence, something shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but a fragile thread of connection. A bond born not of desire or choice, but of shared loneliness. And though she still carried the weight of her stolen freedom, she began to wonder if perhaps her story within these walls would not be one of cruelty, but of an unexpected companionship no one in the village could have imagined. The storm came without warning. The afternoon sky, once bright with sunlight, grew heavy with black clouds that rolled across the horizon like waves. The air turned thick and restless, the birds fell silent, and the villagers hurried to secure their animals and shutter their homes. By evening, the heavens split open, unleashing sheets of rain that pounded the earth until rivers formed in the streets. Thunder cracked so loudly the windows of the grand house rattled in their frames, and lightning painted the walls in fleeting white flashes. Inside, the girl moved quickly from room to room, checking the shutters, placing pots beneath the leaks in the ceiling. Water seeped through cracks in the old roof, dripping onto the polished floors, turning rugs damp and heavy. The servants rushed about with buckets and cloths, but their eyes kept darting toward the master's chamber, where the old man had retreated earlier in the day, already weakened by a cough that had deepened with the change of weather. Her heart pounded as she entered his room, the storm roaring outside like a beast. He was sitting in a chair near the window, staring out at the rain, his cane leaning against the wall. His face was pale, his lips tinged with gray. Sweat glistened on his forehead though the air was cold and damp. When he turned his head toward her, his eyes were glassy, and the strength that once filled them had dimmed. "You should rest," she said softly, moving closer, her voice barely audible above the thunder. He shook his head, a faint, weary smile tugging at his lips. "I've seen many storms in my life. This one, it feels different. Stronger." His voice was weak, each word a struggle. He coughed violently, his body shaking, and she rushed to steady him, placing a hand on his shoulder. The weight of his frailty shocked her. He had always seemed old, yes, but still unyielding, still carried by the authority of his presence. Now, he felt fragile in her hands, like a candle flame about to be snuffed out by the wind. "Please," she whispered, kneeling beside him, "lie down. Let me call for the doctor." He caught her wrist gently, his hand trembling but warm. "No," he said, "no doctor, not tonight." His gaze held hers, filled with something deeper than fear. "I don't want to spend my last storm in a stranger's hands." Her breath caught. The storm raged on, but inside that room, a different kind of silence fell. She searched his face, half in denial, half in terror, and whispered, "Don't say that. You'll be fine. You must be fine." But he shook his head again, leaning back in the chair. "I've carried this body a long way. Longer than it was meant to go. And now, with you here, it doesn't feel so heavy anymore." His eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, a reason to look forward to each morning." Her throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes. She had not expected this, not this confession, not this fragile honesty. All the fear she had carried, the resentment, the bitterness, it mingled now with pity, with sorrow, with something softer she could not name. He reached for her hand, his grip weak but urgent. "Don't leave me," he whispered. "Not now, not when the storm is here." She sank to the floor beside his chair, wrapping both her hands around his, holding it tightly against her chest. "I won't," she promised, her voice breaking. I'll stay with you." Thunder roared above them, shaking the very walls, but she no longer flinched. She focused only on the man before her, the broken soul who had once been her captor but had become something far more complicated. His chest rose and fell with effort, each breath sounding like a battle. She wiped the sweat from his brow with the edge of her sleeve, whispering soothing words she hadn't realized she knew. For a long while, he said nothing. His head leaned back against the chair, his eyes fluttering shut, his hand still locked in hers. She thought he might drift into unconsciousness, but then his lips moved again, his voice faint. Do you know what they all said when she died? They said time would heal me. That one day I'd forget. But they were wrong. Time heals nothing. It only teaches you how to live with the wound. Her tears spilled freely now, falling onto his hand. She wanted to tell him he wasn't alone anymore, that though she had not chosen this life, though she still longed for freedom, she understood his pain. She wanted to tell him she saw the man behind the wealth, behind the cane, behind the sorrow. But the words tangled in her throat, and all she could do was press his hand closer to her heart. The storm howled on, tearing branches from trees, rattling shutters, flooding the courtyard. Yet within the room, time seemed to slow, as though the world outside had ceased to exist. The only sound that mattered was his labored breathing, the only sight that mattered was the way his chest rose and fell, the flicker of life still clinging to him. Hours passed like that, her kneeling by his side, him drifting in and out of wakefulness, their hands entwined. Sometimes he murmured the name of his lost wife, his voice tender, almost boyish. Other times, he called her, child, his tone protective. And once, in a whisper so soft she almost missed it, he said, "You are not her. But you are the reason I can finally let go." Her heart shattered at those words. She pressed her forehead to his hand, sobbing quietly, praying with every fiber of her being that he would make it through the night. Near dawn, when the storm began to ease, his grip loosened. She panicked, sitting up quickly, calling his name, shaking his arm gently. His eyes opened once more, faint light glimmering in them. He looked at her as though memorizing her face, as though etching her into whatever lay beyond this life. "Thank you," he whispered, "for staying." She nodded through her tears, clutching his hand. "Always," she said, "always." And then his eyes closed again, his breathing shallow but steady. She held on to him, refusing to let go, even as the rain softened outside and the first rays of morning light crept into the room. No one in the village would ever know how that night unfolded, how the girl who had been forced into marriage became the one who held a dying man's hand through the storm. They would gossip, they would speculate, but they would never see the truth, that in the heart of a union built on power and sorrow, a bond had formed, fragile, unexpected, yet real. And as she sat there, her fingers still intertwined with his, she realized something she had never believed possible. She was no longer just the girl who had been sold,